Hello and welcome. I'm Liz Booker, literary aviatrix, and I am excited to talk with a nonfiction children's picture book author who found her way to the history of a fascinating woman, a pioneering engineer and aircraft designer, Emma Lillian Todd, in the book Wood, Wire, and Wings. Fewer than 10% of pilots and aircraft mechanics are women. These are their stories of tenacity, adventure, and courage. Stories with the power to inspire, heal, and connect. Welcome to the literary aviatrix community, where we leverage the power of story to build and celebrate our community and inspire the next generation of aviation. Kirsten W. Larson, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being here. I'm excited.
Oh, yeah, me too. I'm so excited about this. So I have had this one particular book on my picture book shelf for a while. I take these books out and do outreach events with young girls, typically for aviation, Girls in Aviation Days. And so it's one of the books that I bring with me. I can't say that I spent a lot of time on it until I started working on this women's history book that is conceived around an undergraduate textbook. And in chapter 1, I'm talking about the ways in which women were participating in aviation in the early years. And so I got excited, reinvigorated for this book. I pulled it up off the shelf and I was like, oh, wow, this is wonderful. Like, it's not just the picture book, it's the back matter. And we're going to get into all of that. So before we get into the book itself, which is Wood, Wire, Wings.
Yeah.
Yep, about Lillian Todd is how I've seen her referred to. Her first name was Emma, I guess. So
Yes.
before we get into the details about her, tell us about you and how you came to writing.
Sure. I used to work for NASA in public affairs, so I tell people that I've been doing science communication for a long time. And I got into writing children's books when my kids were very small. They loved nonfiction. They would go to the library and pull nonfiction books off the shelf about Mars and weather and airplanes and trucks and you name it. And as I read those books, I thought that I could probably write something. I could learn to write them and that it would be a blast to have an excuse to take a deep dive into new topics. So, I was really inspired by library trips with my kids when they were small, and that set me on my course to learn how to do this.
Oh, that's so great. And so how many books have you published?
So, I have 4 picture books out now. Before that, I also did about 20 books for the school and library market. So those are books that are uh, the topics are conceived by the publisher. They give me an assignment to write several books, and then I do that. They're written at a specific grade level. So these are the type of books that are normally sort of resources for school reports, like in a library or a classroom. So I've done about 20 of those, and then I have 4 picture books that are of my own conceiving that I've published.
Yeah, so I can't wait to get into more about how you got how you got into the writing for these other projects. We'll do like 2 portions of this interview because I want to talk about a few of these books in depth, not just the one that we're highlighting today, but also I want to talk about your writing advice because you
Mhm.
also have a book on picture book writing. So I
Right.
definitely want to talk about that stuff. So let's get into it with the 4 books. So what are the titles and a brief summary of the picture books that you've written?
Sure. So my first picture book that to come out was called, as you mentioned, Wood, Wire, Wings. Emma Lillian Todd invents an airplane, illustrated by Tracy Subasak. That is the true story about the first woman to successfully design an airplane on her own, which flew in 1910. Behind you, I have A True Wonder, it's also a true story. It's illustrated by Katie Wu. I think of it as a biography of the Wonder Woman character, how she was conceived, how she came to mean so much to so many women. And then I have The Fire of Stars, the life and brilliance of this woman who discovered what stars are made of. This is illustrated by Catherine Roy. That's the true story about an early astrophysicist named Cecilia Payne who discovered that stars are made of hydrogen and helium at a time when a lot of people thought stars were pretty much like Earth, just a fiery version of Earth. And that was in the 1920s. So that's another true story. And then I have a little bit of a departure, my most current book, which is behind me right there. This is How You Know. It's illustrated by Cornelia Lee. It just came out about 6 weeks ago. And it is for very young kids. It's a very lyrical, poetic book about how science really works. It's not a recipe with steps that we literally follow. It's a little bit more of a twisty path than that. So it's a look into how science really works and all of its beauty and messiness, and then why science is important because it informs, hopefully informs policy decisions, and is a really collaborative process around the world. So that is my most recent book.
Oh my gosh, these are so fascinating. What fun topics that you've picked. Tell me, okay, before we get into the books so I have three of the books that you mentioned behind me, not the newest one. This is How You Know. What inspired you to write that book?
Well, I think part of it goes back to a lot of the patterns that I've seen when writing some of my other books on science topics. I think, and I actually wrote a school and library book about the scientific method where it was presented in a very step-by-step recipe cookie cutter fashion.
Hmm.
But as I've researched all of these engineers and scientists and have learned about how they work, I realized, that's not really how science works. And in fact, that's not actually how kids are supposed to be taught science anymore with the next generation science standards. They're shown that it's more exploratory. So I think it's just a combination of my past work. I thought I was going to write a book about Edwin Hubble, and so I did a lot of research about how he worked. So researching him and some other astronomers also influenced that book. But this book went through a lot of twisty paths. I mean, it was a lot of different things before I realized what I really wanted to tell kids was how science works because I wanted them to be inspired to do it themselves.
Oh, that's so cool. And so then let's talk about, because we're going to get to, is it Ellen? Emma. See,
Emma.
everywhere you find, so everywhere you look for her, you see
Mhm.
Lillian Todd and not her first name. And so that's why her first name hasn't stuck.
Yeah,
But
it's
before,
and she went by Lillian, so yeah,
so
so
okay, that's why.
she went
Yeah.
by her middle name anyway. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so before we get into talking about Emma Lillian Todd, let's just talk a little bit more about the subject of the fire of stars and
Mhm.
also sort of the craft of the book. Just talk about that you have these two sort of characters that are telling a story simultaneously. Talk about that.
Yeah. So, what makes this book a little bit unusual is it is a parallel story. It's two stories in one. So, what you have on every single page is you have part of the life of Cecilia Payne, who I think of as kind of a science superstar, and told alongside that story is how a star is formed, starting from a nebula and, how it forms, how planets are created around it. And so it's kind of two stories in one. And
Hmm.
then when you dive into the back matter, there's a section where it goes step by step and talks a bit more about how stars are formed.
It's a beautiful book. I highly recommend it for everybody's library. It's really, really wonderfully done. Nice job with that. All right, so
Thank you.
let's talk about Emma.
Hmm.
So the reason I am operating in the structure of the book that I'm working on, is the idea is sort of a 15-week undergraduate course. So there's a
Mm.
lot to cover, in not a lot of space. If each chapter is, 5,000 words, I don't have a lot of space to highlight everyone. But because I was looking for role models in our history that show young women that pilot isn't the only job in aviation. We
Hmm.
need engineers, we need mechanics, and that women were working on planes in the earliest days of aviation. And not only that, we had one who was having ideas about how to design them, and then actually had it built and flown. So that's how I came to her, and I got excited about it, and I did a little sidebar about her and researched her beyond what you've written in the book. But let's talk about this lady. Tell us all about her and her life.
Yeah. So I'll say I got the idea for this book from another children's book, which a lot of your readers may have read. It's a best selling book, uh, Rosie Revere, Engineer. And
Absolutely.
the illustrator, David Roberts, in the back has like a 2-page illustrated timeline of
That's
female first in
right.
aviation,
That's
right?
right.
So I tell people, like, I have lived and worked around airplanes my whole life. My dad was a military pilot. I worked for NASA. My husband now works for NASA as a pilot. So, and I literally live under a runway. And when I saw in the timeline, David Roberts saying, Emma Lillian Todd, 1906, first female airplane designer. Literally, no one I knew had ever heard of her. And like my husband is a huge early aviation buff, nothing.
Right.
So that kind of started me on my journey. Like I was like, okay, I have got to find out about this woman, and it's as you know from researching it, it's very complicated because history always prioritizes the winners, the Wright brothers, Curtis, right? So if you were a married woman or a single woman, who's gonna who's gonna keep your story, right? Who's a lot of There were a lot of married women working alongside their husbands, but they also don't get credit, and it's really hard to parse out their contributions because it was all about their husbands. But Lillian Todd, was a single woman. She did not marry. Uh, so it was, we know what her actual contributions were. But it was really just reading about her in that children's picture book that made me think like, okay, here's a woman whose story has been left out of history. And I really wanted to share that with young readers, both boys and girls, because I think for everybody, it's important to see that women were working in aviation, inspired by the future of flight from the earliest days.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Absolutely. All right, so she has this lovely personality on the page in your book, and it seems to echo the quotes and things that I read about her. So obviously, that's what you were hoping to achieve. Tell us about her as a person.
Yeah, so I think what fascinates me about her is, she's very clearly a tinkerer from her earliest days. I will say her story was hard to piece together because there was, a lot of times when I'm writing a book about, someone, there is maybe an autobiography or a journal or, even a biography, a secondary source that I can start with. There was nothing like that for her. So I had to piece together everything from archival newspapers. Fortunately, a woman doing this kind of work in that day was an oddity. So newspapers were covering her extensively. And so I found some very good magazine articles and newspaper articles. There's a great one from Woman's Home Companion. But she talks a lot about, how she was this tinkerer as a girl. Her mother was very supportive. She tells a story about only getting in trouble one time when she took her mother's sharp scissors. Her mother was a seamstress, and used them to cut some wire and dulled them. But most of the time, her mother was perfectly fine with her taking apart clocks to see how they worked, even if she couldn't get them back together. So she was very much a tinkerer. And um, I think one thing that I find so fascinating about her, in that time period, a lot of these early people working in aviation, as soon as they built these airplanes, it was all about setting records. We want to go fast, we want to go high, right? We want to see how far we can go. And I think what really fascinated me about her was she actually saw aviation as a very practical invention. She was not so much interested in going faster, higher, farther. She was thinking, oh, I see this possibility for all these different ways we are going to use airplanes in the future, to survey, for fun, to fly and have a picnic in the, in the country. She thought, unfortunately, that they would be used in war, which they were. But she really saw this whole future of flight. And then she actually started the junior aero club in America, where she had these boys into her apartment and she taught them about flying, and they built kites and models and all these things. So, I think of it as kind of like an early maker space where kids could come and learn about aviation and build things. So, she was a really, she just, when you read her quotes, I mean, she is just such a personality, and really was in love with the process of building and designing and the possibility of flight. So she's just such a character.
She was working too in the patent office, correct? And
Mhm.
so that was feeding into her imagination as well, where she was reading some of these ideas that other people were putting forward and thinking, "Oh, I maybe have a better spin on this."
Exactly. I mean, she was working, because what is a woman, right? In the turn of the century, it's not like she's going to go to engineering school, right? So she's a tinkerer, but she's like, okay, well, what do I do? She was self taught. So she became a typist in the US Patent Office at a time when all these people were submitting patents for their ideas of how things could fly. And there's a great spread in the book that's based on a lot of patent designs from the period that Tracy did, and you see people with, wings on their arms, balloons, things that look like houseboats in the sky. I mean, it's just people had all kinds of ideas that they sent to the patent office for what they thought would work. And even when she saw early designs from the Wright brothers, those earliest Wright flyers, they were laying on their stomach and they're using their hips to do the wing warping. And so as she's looking at a lot of these early designs from the Wrights and also from Santo Dumont, who is Brazilian, his was like a bunch of boxes stuck together. And she's like, okay, but that's not like what birds look like. And who's going to want to lay on their stomach and like, if we're going to have airplanes, we need something that can, carry a couple of people for a good distance. So like it's practical. So she looked at some of these early designs and she thought, I think I can do something better. And so that encouraged her. And she was very inspired by birds, crows that she saw, albatrosses' wings that she saw in the Natural History Museum in New York. And so that kind of bird-like design really influenced her.
And so she designed this plane, built it, and somebody actually flew it. You
Yeah.
talk about
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. So she had to go through a lot of and error. She had what I imagine was a very embarrassing foray. She tried to show it off at this big fair in New York, this big tri-state fair. But at that time, she was using a car engine, which was too heavy and didn't work because it was really hard to get your hands on an airplane engine at that time. They just weren't. they didn't roll off an assembly line like they do now. Um, so she had to keep, working and trying new things. And, I love to talk to kids about this book because I like to show them like we don't get it right the first time, right? And sometimes you fail and you fail publicly. And then what do? You try again.
Yep.
So, finally, she got to the point in 1910 where the plane was ready to fly. Um, and so, she did. She really never, from what I can tell in the research, she really never had designs to fly herself. She was always more of an engineer. And
Mhm.
so she wanted to observe her plane as it flew. And so a male pilot, took her plane out and, yeah, and it flew.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it was amazing.
Well, it's a great story. And I say this to authors like you all the time. It's such a joy and honor when somebody who has the skill to write the book and get it published finds their way, their interest leads them to one of our stories. And I think this is just a wonderful story to have preserved for our history. And I'm glad you did it. So thank you for the work that you've done. And have you had what kind of reactions have you had from your audience about the book?
Well, I will say, I mean, obviously that book has been out the longest, but the
Mhm.
thing that I love is that it has gotten adopted into curricula.
Good.
It has appeared on lists like the Society of Women in Engineering has, a
Good.
recommended books list. So it actually, it's been very successful beyond my wildest dreams. I mean, it at one point it was in a Kiwi crate, as part of a Kiwi crate. So I mean, in terms of, I mean, it's like I said, it's been out for 5 years, but it's been popular beyond my wildest expectations.
That's wonderful. That makes
Yeah.
me so happy. Well, and I also I'm grateful for you mentioning the concept around what was going on for women in terms of education at the time, and the fact that she wouldn't automatically have
Mhm.
been, schooled in engineering and sciences, and sort of that sort of leads us into the next. But before we talk about Wonder Woman, so excited to talk about her. Is there anything else you wanted to say about um, Lillian Todd?
No, I mean, I'm so honored that I got to tell her story. It's always a thrill for me, and then of course the greatest thrill is when readers actually respond to it, right? You
Yeah,
can't ask for anything better. So I love that we're able to kind of put these women back into history. So it's just
I love it
exciting.
too. I love it. So, all right, let's talk about a true wonder. I am
Mhm.
so excited about this. So, I mentioned this textbook that I am writing, and it's working title. We're not there yet, but it's a women's history in aviation.
Mhm.
And what I'm trying to do is hit the major beats like of our history, select specific characters that sort of illustrate a point in that history. And that's, obviously, like I explained, with Lillian Todd's story being part of the engineering thread of that story. But where I'm basing this, or sort of the backdrop, the context that I'm giving the reader, is not just the history of aviation and its, technological advancement and also sort of regulatory advancement and those kinds of things and how those things affected women, but where we women were in our evolution, in our various waves of feminism and
Oh, right.
women's rights in history. And so that's what we get. You do this so well, and I do not pretend to be an expert in gender studies, feminism. I am learning as I work through this project, but just thinking about what Wonder Woman represents and the way in which you sort of gave us the parallel of what was going on in society,
Mhm.
and how it follows sort of that feminist path. Can you talk about it? Tell us about Wonder Woman.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, I'm always kind of gravitating to underdog stories or counterintuitive stories that are kind of counterintuitive. And the thing that's so fascinating about Wonder Woman is, she was conceived in the early days of superheroes, alongside people like Superman. And she was kind of, again, conceived as this sort of counterintuitive hero. So, whereas a lot of the male superheroes, it was all about strength and fighting and beating up the bad guys. She was going to have this lasso of truth, right? She was going to be about truth and justice, and she's deflecting bullets, but she's not firing bullets, so she's really conceived as this different form of heroism, which I find fascinating.
Hmm.
Um, and the other thing that I found interesting, and the reason I think of it as a biography of this particular character, is, as you said, I mean, her journey kind of follows the history of women in the United States, right? So, when you look at World War II, when we have a lot of women going to work in factories, the real life Rosie the Riveters, and she's very popular and represented as this very powerful superhero. And then you watch these kind of turns as women, the men come home, women lose their jobs, women are kind of forced back into domesticity solely, right? So they're not allowed to work in the factories anymore. And what you see is, at that point, her original creator, William Moulton Marston, was gone, and the new people that took on the comic uh, really changed the tone of Wonder Woman. I mean, she became concerned about her love interests and fashion, and she wasn't really she wasn't represented as the powerful superhero that she had, until you get into you know 1970s feminism, and women are starting to protest this view of Wonder Woman, and they want her powers restored. They want her to, come back to her true superhero glory. And so it's just fascinating to me, how she kind of follows what's happening with women in the country. But it's so funny. I mean, she was an inspiration for Gloria Steinem and Ms. Magazine. She appeared on the cover of Ms. As like the first female president, Wonder Woman for president. So it's just a fun story. And of
Oh,
course, we have like the Patty Jenkins. I love the Patty Jenkins Wonder Woman movies. So that was kind of my inspiration, is when the first Wonder Woman movie came out, and I saw so many women moved by that movie. And it was an event, right? Before the Barbie movie was an event movie, the Wonder Woman movie was an event movie. And you went with your girlfriends or your sister or your mother, and you dressed up, and
I did
yeah.
that. Yes, I did that. I did that. We all went Wonder Woman. Yes, we actually did. a bunch of ladies in the military. We all dressed up in
Hmm.
our, yep, and we went. Yeah. And, so the story is really fascinating. Now I have a question for you. This is a children's book,
Yes.
so it doesn't necessarily have all of the juicy lore that I have heard.
Right. Right.
But like, this is the grown up conversation. So now there was a movie that I have
Yes.
seen, Professor Marston and his Wonder Women.
Yes. And some things, I mean, I will say, I think the you know, biopic is a little sensationalized.
Yeah.
But I mean, there is evidence that Wonder Woman's creator was in like a, polyamorous relationship. I'm not exactly sure what the term is, but
Yeah.
he had children with two
It
women.
was some kind of love
Essentially kind of like
triangle. Yeah.
an open marriage.
Yeah.
Um, so I will say, when I first became inspired to tell this story, because of that, I really didn't want to make it a biography of William Moulton Marston, right?
Yeah.
So, and telling a bigger story about the character and focusing on the character and her arc and how she's changed and grown gave me some opportunities to put some other women back in the story, like Joy Hummel, who wrote co-wrote many of the comics, especially when William Moulton Marston was ill, but was never credited because they were writing under a pen name.
Yeah.
So, this telling a broader story gave me an opportunity to talk about Joy Hummel and Linda Carter and Patty Jenkins and kind of these different women who have had a role in Wonder Woman. But I will say, when you're writing, especially picture books, they're so short. You can only tell a slice of the story. In this case, the fact that I wasn't going to tell William Moulton Marston's whole story was a good thing
Yeah.
for kids.
For kids. Yeah, it's
Mhm.
just a challenge to frame that for a children's audience, but I find it interesting to think about, what kind of man, because at the time, he was the one who had to push this forward. And what years was that around?
This is like the 1930s. Yeah.
30s. Yeah, so it was
hmm
30s. So yeah, I mean, what kind of man is going to glorify women in this particular way? What are his influences? And so it was an interesting backstory to learn from that movie, but also just the whole aspect of him having to fight for it. Also, because they were like, we tried female superheroes and they didn't go
Right.
over, and she
Yeah.
ended up.
Well, and yeah, I'm sorry.
No, you go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, he was really, again, the other thing I find really interesting is so parents and librarians, were very anti a lot of the violence that they saw in comics.
Right.
And this is kind of the lead into a lot of regulation of comics, and because of this horrible influence that they are on children.
Right.
So but he saw how his own kids responded to comic books and how they love to read them. And so he's really, William Moulton Marston's really thinking about, like, can these be a tool for positive development in children?
Yes.
And so that, plus, he's thinking about this, he's writing about this.
Right.
And he was a psychologist by training. So he's thinking about this, he's writing about this. And then, there's this quote from his wife who, she says, "Oh, there's all these Superman. Why can't we have a Superwoman?" Right. And so he starts to kind of put these ideas together. Comics as a positive influence. Let's develop a new type of superhero, perhaps who's not so violent and prone to fighting, and, maybe a woman. And this is kind of how he brings it all together.
It's fabulous. I love it. And then you talk, I mean, you do cover a lot of ground
hmm
for the amount of space that you have in a picture book. You do cover a lot of ground and do it very skillfully because you show us how, after World War II, people didn't they were kind of weary of all the fighting you talk
hmm
about, like you mentioned before. Now they turn her into sort of a we're going to influence the next generation and train them to go back into the home. And she's thinking about getting married and
Yeah.
that kinds of things that they were projecting to women
hmm
in the late 1940s and in the 50s. And so it is exciting to me that she comes back, she has the comeback, and the way that you tell the story is excellent. And that's kind of like Wonder Woman is an avatar for the group of women that I'm thinking about and writing about, and how they come back and with a vengeance, and but
Yeah.
still fighting today. So
Right.
still fighting for justice today.
well, and I mean, I wrote this book, I think one of the final lines, I'm trying to inspire future, young girls. And I'm like, maybe someday in the future, president, they might be president, right? Like we still haven't seen it.
I
But,
know.
yeah. Right. So anyway, my hope is with this book, again, to show kids of, boys and girls, um, to encourage them to think about heroism and how we can all be heroes, and how it doesn't have to be, a strong, violent, we can all have a different type of heroism. And sometimes it's these people who are leaning into truth and justice and peace, that uh, can provide a better future. So,
Perfect. Well said. I couldn't have said that better myself. Well, this is so wonderful. And Kirsten, I am so grateful for you sharing this. I want to talk more about writing, but before
Sure.
we do, um, what are you working on now? Is there anything you want to talk about?
Well, actually, since we're going to jump into writing, I will say that I am revising a prequel to my book on writing, which is
Reimagining your
reimagining your nonfiction picture book, which is focused on nonfiction picture books. So what I'm working on right now is I'm jumping back and I'm doing a more general book about writing nonfiction for children. So
Oh,
whether
cool.
it's magazine articles, school and library books, middle grade, young adult, kind of giving a bigger picture view into how we research and write nonfiction for kids.
Oh, well, that's excellent. So for anybody out there who is interested in doing that, come back and listen to the rest of our conversation about writing. But before we move on, where can people find you and your books? And then do you have any events coming up where people can see you in person? Tell me where to find you.
Sure. So everything is on my website, kirstenwlarson.com, and it's well, it'll be in the show notes. It's just like the American Girl doll, but with my initial W inserted between. I have all my books there, and I do have a podcast about writing called Nonfiction Kidlit Craft Conversations that folks can hear on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. And I teach a lot of writing classes. So anything I'm teaching, folks can access through my website as well. So I periodically host live webinars. I have some ongoing classes. So folks can find me there.
Oh, very cool. Well, Kirsten, thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to getting into the conversation about writing.
Awesome.
Thank you.